They're two happy women bringing you inspiring stories, politics, pop culture, and lifestyle hacks, all with an eye to making our communities and our country a better place to live. It's the Happy Women Podcast with your hosts, Jen Horn and Katie Gorka.
Thanks for joining us and welcome to another episode of the Happy Women Podcast. I'm Jennifer Horn.
And I'm Katie Gorka.
And so excited to introduce you to our guest this week. And that's because there are a lot of people I admire for actually seeing that there's a problem and actually doing something, getting in the fight, no matter what kind of rocks and stones and arrows are thrown in her direction. She is out there trying to fight to protect what is at the core of our republic and our democracy. That is our vote. And you've probably heard her before. She's all over the radio, and she is the founder of True the Vote. Catherine Englebrecht is here. You can give them a follow on social media at True the Vote. And Catherine, just so nice to have you and welcome to Happy Women.
Oh gosh, thanks so much for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
For your fight, that's for sure. Now, as we start every episode and we're talking to these inspiring people, I always like to know how your story began, because everybody has that moment where they know they have to get engaged. So what was that like for you, and what was your story to get you to this point?
My story is sort of a quite by accident story. I never went looking for any of this, but here we are some 15 years after it began for me. I started in 2008 when the Tea Party sort of birthed into the conscious of America. I found myself being very drawn to the idea that people who maybe had never been involved before were now going to try to step in and figure out what they can do locally. And I did just that. Met people along the way and quickly realized that as exciting as the rallies were, that what really spoke to me more loudly was finding a path to do something that was sustainable and positively contributing specifically locally. And about that time, we had heard that there was a need for people to work at the polls. Now we're flashing into 2009. And so a very small group that had met at Tea Party rallies said, okay, well, let's go work at the polls. And when we did, we saw problems that made you question, if this is what happens when people are watching, what happens when nobody's watching? And in fact, the places that we were involved had been just that type of example. People hadn't been there for years and years. And so this was all a big wake up call. Based on the problems that we saw, we thought, let's take a deeper look. The majority of the problems centered around errors in the poll book. And this was before Texas had photo voter identification. And so it was very sort of this nebulous process of showing a piece of paper that said it was your voter registration card. And on more than one occasion, I saw people come in and present that card and then be told that already indicated that they had voted. And then they would pull out another card in a different name. And then that person would be allowed to vote with this different voter registration. And when you see that happening, you go, time out. That can't be legal, but it happens in the blink of an eye. And then what do you do? So we, after the election day activities and after all of that, the primary had wrapped up in 2009 was an off-year election in Texas. But nonetheless, we went through the process. Then we began to look at the voter rolls and realized that there appeared to be an effort underway to intentionally bloat and exploit the voter rolls. So we did a pretty involved process comparing registrations as they had been submitted to the county. It was Harris County, at the time the second largest voting block in the country, Houston, Texas. We submitted all of this to the county, all of our findings. And the county called a press conference. They were elated that a citizen group had done this kind of legwork. And it unbeknownst to us, they were under a consent decree that was preventing them from questioning incoming registration. So the stars had aligned. We didn't even know really what we had fallen into, but we presented our work. County calls a press conference. And 3 days later, all of Harris County's election equipment, 10,000 machines and $30 million in collateral, was all burnt to the ground in a huge fire. And the next thing I know, I'm in Washington with my children at a rally, and my phone starts going crazy and voicemails piling up. Turns out that the New York Times appeared on the site and of the fire, had already gotten wind that what they considered to be the catalyzing event had to be something connected to our submission to the county, and sort of loosely linked me to the arson. And then Huffington Post came out and called our group the largest. Remember, we're just a small group of people, probably less than 24 at this point, that had just sort of found our way together, business professionals looking to make a sustainable difference. And Huffington Post came out and called us the largest voter suppression effort ever in the history of the country. And it was like a dog whistle had sounded. And suddenly we went from this meager, let's just work at the polls and check that off our citizen list and move on to something else, to what became this now going on 15-year odyssey of trying to unpack why it is that our elections have been set up to be perpetually broken when there is no need for it. It should not be a difficult task to register people, let them vote, count the votes, manage the records, and do it again the next election cycle. But we've reached a place where the fraud over the many decades now has become institutionalized in a way that it makes it very difficult to gather up all the loose ends. And so you end up on this sort of, fighting a 1,000-front war. And I look back over all the many years and all the adventures, and there have been many, including being targeted by the IRS and undergoing 23 different audits or investigations by 5 different government agencies, and having never been in court before I started True the Vote, and since starting True the Vote, having never been out of court, being slandered in every imaginable way, having my personal life turned on its head. All of that, though, because I feel that as you opened the top of the show, Jen, you're exactly right. This is the cornerstone of what it means to be a representative republic, is to have your vote matter, have the ability to be heard at the ballot box. And so we continue on, but I look back now and I see that everything I've been through has been about what is coming in the next 130 some odd days. This is for all the marbles, and I would do it all again to be as prepared as I feel like we are coming into this November.
All right. I have about 100 questions because you just raised so many amazing things. I did not know that backstory. And I will just say, so the last time I saw you was maybe a year, 2 years ago. Since that time, a lot in my life has changed because I'm now the chair of the Fairfax County GOP. So we are really gearing up. And I have to say, on the one hand, I am both kind of blown away by the bad things that I'm seeing. I think it's just really terrifying, right, to see the level of fraud and, all kinds of problems going on. On the other hand, I also feel hugely encouraged. So
that's right.
We are cooperating in a way, as I understand it, that the local GOP never has before. I'm seeing incredible cooperation between local GOP, the RNC, who has Christina Bobb working on this, which is great. They have made a very serious commitment to election integrity. We're working closely with our state party and with the Trump campaign, and they are going all in on election integrity. So I'm sort of encouraged, and I hope we can maybe end up in a place of give us some hope. But before we get there, I just have to ask you to go back to a couple things. First of all, I think talking about the poll watchers is so important because we've kind of gone through the same thing here, right? Where we didn't have them, then we fought to get them. Now we're trying to decide, because it is hard to staff up all these precincts, right? So we here in Fairfax, at least, have election officers as well as poll watchers. And I think the poll watchers are super important. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you see that role having evolved. And it is one of the things that I think both Jen and I most often, when we're out talking to people, we will most often say, you've got a role to play, you've got to get involved. And being a poll watcher is a great place to start. So I'd love to hear how that's evolved. But you have to tell me a little bit more about the fire. Did anybody ever get to the bottom of it? And, do you have suspicions? Was there any, do you think it was just a random, or what are your thoughts about that now?
Well, To the best of my knowledge, it was never solved, nor was there ever any, primary suspect, I guess, that ever came forward. It was such a strange time where the fire occurred, and then all of these, the audits and investigations started. I was sued twice straight out of the gate. It was as if, the deep state all got out their baseball bats for, batting practice at my kneecaps, trying to do everything they could to get me to go away. And I don't consider myself to be a political person, but I am a fighter, and I'm not going to back down from a fight, particularly when I know that what we are doing is right. And, it begs the question, what could we be so close to that the full weight and force of the federal government, that politicos and power brokers were suddenly engaged in what it was that I was doing with True the Vote, that these curious things continue to occur, like a fire that, torched millions and millions of, so many things that I knew we were on the right path. And the hits haven't gotten any easier. They just came all at once to begin with, for sure.
Well, I'll let you circle back on Katie's question on poll workers, because I think this is such a huge piece. And then I have a question for you about voter fraud, but touch on that. So what has changed? Sure. How important are those people who volunteer to make sure that everything is at least on the up and up? Because for a long time, there wasn't one Republican representative that was just in every single polling place. I think now that's our goal, is to try to make sure that you've got people from at least both sides there taking a peek at things.
Absolutely correct. You need parity of party. It's a tongue twister, but we say parity of party at the polls. Yeah. You need both Republicans and Democrats. And of course, True the Vote is a nonpartisan organization. We're thrilled to work with Democrats just as Republicans if it means getting parity of party staffing at those polling places. And when we first started, we didn't know the process of how to get plugged in through the county. So we started as poll watchers. And of course, every state calls that position. Some call it poll challengers, some are poll watchers. But generally speaking, broadly speaking, that's the position where you are observing. You're not talking to anybody except whoever the lead is there at the polling place. You're just observing. And it's critically important, because if you see something going sideways, if you see a problem, you can report it in a way that brings new awareness outside of just the team that's working typically sort of behind the table, if you will, at the polls. That said, though, if you think about the priority, the first priority is to make sure that you have sufficient staffing at the polls. Again, every state manages this a little bit differently, but generally speaking, you have whomever is the lead. In Texas, I'll give you an example where it's called the judge position, and then you have the opposing party is the alternate judge, and so you serve in those dual capacities, and then you have clerks that work to support the judges, and together they make a full complement of the polling place team. You need those positions filled first as priority, but again, generally speaking, you need to go through a party or candidate of your choice, or you can certainly reach out directly to your county and say that you want to be involved. But the sooner you can do that, the better, because counties are now trying to figure out who's going to work where and how they're going to organize at the polls. Of course, those are the only polling place positions, right? You have opportunities to work for absentee ballot review, where you can review the incoming ballots and the signature verification. You have opportunities to work at central count. And then if you're plugged in directly to your local party or to a candidate in their campaign, wherever the need is for their own election integrity resources to be. Maybe it's working at the party war room, whatever it may be. We need all hands on deck. There should be no polling position, no election position left unmanned this November or earlier, depending upon the state. But all are important, and just dip your toe in and get going, because there's no time to waste.
And the reason I think that's so important, and Katie, I know that you have the same feeling, is that when people think about voter fraud, I think that we think of like some, I always, I'm a kid of the 80s. So I always think of Inspector Gadget, the big evil guy who sat there with his cat going, but really, when we think about voter fraud today, our elections are being decided by 100, a couple of thousand, maybe 10,000 votes. And so it's the little stuff that really needs to be identified. It's not like some big guy pressing a button. What it is that all of these little places where there's room for mistake, where there's room for errors, and people capitalize on that. And that really determines the outcome of an election, which is why we all need to be involved with this process. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, it seems to me, I think most of us, when we think about voter fraud for the first time, think it's this grand scheme with one person behind it, but that's not necessarily the case.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at this issue, because there are things that when you look at it over the benefit of time along the continuum of if you're asking the question, how did we get here? Yeah. I can make a pretty strong case that there have been intentional efforts to destabilize and degrade the process to the point that we now find it. But on balance, most people still to this moment, most Americans want for accurate outcomes. Doesn't party aside, most people want to come, do a good job, and be proud of the process. There are, however, a contingent that are looking to exploit the vulnerabilities, and that's the balance that you have to find. And so the more people that you can put into positions where you're just trying to do the right thing, you're trying to follow the law, you're observing what's going on, the more it suppresses the opportunities for fraud to manifest, because you're just kind of squeezing it out. You can't hide in such a transparent teamwork environment. So the more honest eyes and ears engaged, the better. You don't need a whole lot of fraud, as you rightly say. I think the current number is, I believe it's about 25% of our elections are decided by 2 points or less. And so you don't need a whole lot of fraud. You just need a little in the right places. And when we've created a system that is so vulnerable in so many ways that unless you know how to shore up those vulnerabilities, you can find yourself, being taken advantage of. And it's prior to 2020, a lot of people didn't really understand just how difficult it is. Sometimes I liken working in the space of election integrity to harvesting fog or to nailing jello. You see these problems, but then when you try to go and whether it's a lawsuit or it's some type of official action, it just kind of falls apart. Again, I submit that I believe in many ways it's by design, because as opposed to sticking to the letter of the law, you don't really have a law that supports any single letter. You have kind of this swampy underbelly that ultimately things fall through the cracks and then can't be decided because the law is not clear. The process is so antiquated, it's no longer applicable. And so that's just where we find ourselves. All of that aside, though, Jen, I too am incredibly optimistic, because so many more millions of Americans are now awake and engaged and excited about voting and looking to the process. And that's what we need to hold fast to. Yes, there are problems, and there will still be problems coming into November. It will not be perfect, but it will be made so much more closer to perfect by people being involved. And then we can work together on the other side of this. God willing, pro-liberties prevails, we'll have an opportunity to make those necessary reforms. But for this moment, we are all in it together, and we need to, dig in and roll up our sleeves and put on our waders and just get busy.
So one of the things that's come to my attention that I think I have found particularly disturbing is the role of our foreign enemies. So, one of the things I found is that here in Virginia, there was Chinese funding put into blanketing certain types of voters, Democrat voting voters, with voter registration forms, some people getting as many as 6 or 7 copies of the form. And then just today, the Heritage Foundation has come out with a new report. You can find it on their website, talking about some of the ways in which China is trying to sow discord and to destabilize our country. We also saw, this gets away from the voting, but we've also seen Chinese funding was helping to foment those protests on college campuses. But I'm just curious, because you've been in this for so long and you have dug so deeply into it. Have you seen evidence of foreign countries interfering in this as well? Or do you think this is really purely a domestic problem?
Oh, no, it's, we uncovered back in the beginning of 2021, a company called Konnech, Konnech, that is a front for the Chinese Communist Party. They run election software. They were running for a period of time in Fairfax County, although my understanding is they now no longer are. But they served election support soup to nuts, everything from printing ballots to counting ballots and all points in between, including management of all of the election workers. So kind of think of them as functioning as human resources. They were responsible for the scheduling in the various counties of who was going to work and how they got paid. So they were tied into their bank accounts, and they were responsible for the inventory management, facilities management. They have all the passwords for all of the machines, all the jump drives, all of the collateral. And so we worked I say for, that's not true. Let me revise that. We worked with the FBI, having turned this information over, because we saw it as a national security threat, which it certainly was, and work with them for the better part of a year, believing that they would do what we thought they were doing, which was advancing this investigation. We went and met with several senators. We tried to bring awareness, and in the end, the FBI turned their attentions against or away from Konnech and onto myself and my partner, Greg Phillips. And ultimately, it was recommended to us to go public with what we had before the FBI tried to make us out to be the bad guys inexplicably in this. It ended up in a series of events that, for a short period of time, found myself and my partner, Greg Phillips, put into prison. And then we were released by emergency decision from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And what I can tell you about Konnech, having been very involved in the translation of many documents from China, they were very proud of controlling the elections in many of the largest counties. Again, Fairfax being one, Los Angeles County being one.
Where I know them from.
All over the country. Yeah. Right. All over the country.
I think, speaking of swampy underbellies, our DA, George Gascon, actually had the opportunity to charge, and then there was some scandal where he chose not to charge. I mean, it's a really interesting story if you trace it back. Yeah, that's
right. And paid him $5 million. Paid Eugene Yu, the CEO, who now lives in Malaysia, by the way. He was jettisoned out by the helpful intelligence community out of the United States and into Malaysia. But this too will have another day in court, because the DA, who was initially involved in, that's not true, not the DA, the assistant DA, a gentleman by the name of Eric Neff, who was responsible for the initial prosecution. And then when George Gascon found out that it was True the Vote that had been the ones who had come forward with the information, he, when given the choice, right, to protect his community from being exploited by the Chinese Communist Party versus giving any ounce of credit to an organization he perceived to be as pro-liberty, he chose the CCP over us.
Yeah. And even greater, he didn't want to give Trump anything to argue with.
That's exactly right. Oh, my word. Absolutely, yes. Well, Trump, to his credit, came out and credited George Gascon and said he's doing the right thing. Well, that was just, beyond the pale for Gascon, or it seemed to be. So he benched Eric Neff, and that has all now. Eric was under, again, I've watched this from afar, but was under his own investigation, which he, of course, came through with flying colors, no problems. And now that has reached its end, Eric has filed suit against Los Angeles County for what they did to him. And I look forward to the coming opportunities to have the full story told, because as Eric rightly said, what we showed to him and what his team further uncovered was the largest breach of election data, U.S. election data, as far as anybody can tell in the history of the country. And it's extremely pervasive, and it goes, in fact, beyond elections into our military and into our public schools. They had hooks into all of those. And shameful that it was covered up by the FBI and the Department of Justice.
You know, talking to, I live in Los Angeles, so I'm all over the DA's office, and he has a 97, 98% disapproval rating with the DAs under him, due in part to stuff like this. And that's why there is a good chance that we'll actually get him out of office in November. But, you know, it's amazing that he was on the right track to actually doing something right, which is so infrequent for him. But the minute politics comes into play, that's when everything has to snap back again. They are so interested in protecting themselves. And this kind of has to do with my next question, Catherine, and that is the amnesty that was granted by Joe Biden a couple of weeks ago to 500,000, maybe 1 million people. We know the border's wide open. Paths are being offered to citizenship all the time. And look, I want our country to have the best and brightest immigrants, but we need to have a system of checks and balances. And obviously, I think the scheme that Democrats are after is looking to not only make blue cities bluer and get more congressional representation into blue states, probably, but also ultimately at the end of the day, register more voters. In California, anybody who gets a driver's license, and anyone can, has to opt out of being registered to vote. That's an extreme area for voter fraud, where even if the immigrant isn't trying to commit voter fraud by getting registered illegally or throwing out their ballot, somebody else with ill intentions can get a hold of it. It is just a recipe for disaster. Is this all part of the plot?
I think so. I mean, This all started back in the early 90s under the National Voter Registration Act, where it was mandated that social service programs all carry with them, by way of their application for their various services, a voter registration form, except that the form needed to be baked into the application so that you didn't ask any more questions. There were no redundant questions. You just sort of filled out the application for the service, and then you had to know to opt out to not be registered. It used to be, when this first started in the early 90s, you had to opt in. So at least there was a greater chance that you would, avoid the problem. Then during the Obama administration, they changed that so that you had to opt out. It was also a different story back in the early 90s when this was passed, because the types of social service programs, ranging from welfare to Medicaid to HUD housing and so many different programs in between, they were only available to citizens of the United States. During the Obama administration, many of those programs were made available to non-citizens. And this is where the waters begin to get very, very murky, because now you've got social service programs registering non-citizens for programs that they are, according to the current laws on the books, they are entitled to. But what was never done to the degree it should have been is how to manage for the voter registration that's baked into those programs that is not legal for non-citizens to participate in. And so we've been acutely aware of this. It really, my interest was first piqued in this problem back in 2012, just after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, when a leftist group by the name of Demos came out with a celebratory handbook that was widely distributed among the ranks of the left. And the title, to paraphrase, was How to Register 68 Million New People to Vote Through the Affordable Care Act. And they were just delighting in the fact that this new, Autobahn of voter registration had been opened up through healthcare.gov. But what we know as a practical matter is the checks and balances to manage and to keep citizen and non-citizen separated in some way was never fully anchored in to any IT process. And so flash forward, we see one of the very first things that Biden does through executive order in 2021 was to call upon all of these social service programs to make it their priority to register voters. Then we see the meltdown at the southern border with all of these social service programs being given to non-citizens and deployed by the modern day navigator. Remember navigators back in the day that handled the healthcare.gov stuff? Now they're the NGOs. They're registering non-citizens. And so a sane person would think, okay, this is clearly a disaster, but surely the states have access to the data they need so that they can look at their voter rolls and determine if these registrations are coming in from these social service programs, they can determine the citizenship status of those incoming registrations. Not so, not the case. States don't have nearly the act. They're given a very slim sliver of a database to work with. So it's a database that's sort of styled that you almost have to you have to know the answer before you ask the question. You can't just bump up your list against the, CBP1 programming that is being used now at the border, which is what should happen. So I do have great concern, and for many more reasons than what I've just gone into. I do have great concern that this could be one of the, the popular term these days is the black swan moment coming in October. I believe that you could make a strong case that either by further executive order, Biden can inject, yet another round of chaos like he's done with these most recent amnesties, what is it? Am I a citizen? Am I not? Can I vote? Can I not? If I've already been registered and I show up, how does anybody stop me? Because I've got a work permit that's a social security number. I've got a driver's license that looks like everybody else's driver's license, or I'm going to be in a state that does same day registration where you're not going to be able to check anyway. You can't separate the wheat from the chaff at that point. Once that vote is cast, you're done. And so we started a project called the 611 Project with True the Vote. It has a number of different features to it, but one of them is a way to reach out to your representatives with very specific calls to action. And one of them is demanding that they be given access from the federal government, just the data that they need. So all of this to say, and we can talk about it, continue to talk about it in whatever level of depth, but I'll leave you on this point. This is a problem, as bad as it is, that is just a function of data. This can be addressed before the November election if the political will is there to make sure that non-citizens are not on the voter rolls. That can be done quite effectively before November. But the question is, how badly does anybody in current power really want it? Because it will require that work be done soon if we're going to get it accomplished.
So you've been involved in so many initiatives, so many different ways of fighting this over the years. You've done the legal side, you've done exposure, you've done public information, you've done film. I'm just curious, what do you think has been the most effective in fighting back?
The American people. Just always coming back to talk to the people that we can reach, and that, and the butterfly effect of it all, right? That, our footprint is this, but the ripples go. I mean, when I first started Truth the Vote, there was no election integrity effort at all. And, wow. In fact, I can remember going to DC twice a month and trying to how do you start something and do it properly? I had no go-by. I have no context for what it should look like. And I can remember back in the day going to all the standard weekly meetings and having person upon person tell me, why are you doing that? You're playing at the margins. There's really nothing there. And I'm like, no, I've seen it. It's a dysfunctional process, and it's just a matter of time. We can only kick the can so far. This must be addressed. We're being left in the dust by comparison to other industrialized nations. We're the laughing stock of the globe. Even the United Nations doesn't consider elections taken primarily by mail to be legitimate. We're going in the wrong direction, and we need to be aware. But now we're at a point where we've, it's the good and the bad, right? We've kicked the can to the edge of the abyss. And now I think Americans know. So I think the greatest accomplishment, and it's been the mission of True the Vote from the outset, is to empower citizens to take a stand. mean, we can file suits, we can do analysis, we can do exposures, but until you get your own pound of flesh in there, you don't feel it. But once you feel it, you sense the importance of it, you sense the gravity of it, and it's a humbling time to be a part of this movement now when so many great patriots are stepping in and maybe brand new to the space, but they know that it's time for them to serve. And I couldn't be more excited about the direction that we're headed. I think we are headed to a place where November, we see, we hear the full-throated vote of the American people. And then after that, I think we are, God willing, in looking at a renaissance of election integrity and doing a lot of things that maybe should have been done a long time ago, but better late than never.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of final question for me. I feel like we could talk to you like forever, Catherine. You're so interesting and you have so much great knowledge about this subject. But I think for people who hear you and say, yes, we are awake, we do want to be part of the process. But what if we see something? Like, what happens? What are we supposed to do? And they might need some direction into channeling that. I've had a million people who listen to this podcast or who listen to my radio show and they go, Jen, we saw this. And I always talk about your organization. I talk about the Election Integrity Project, getting involved with the local GOPs, but what should people do when they see something, or even if they're getting ballots into their house that shouldn't be sent there? What's the right step?
So every cycle we spin up a program that's called, well, this year we've renamed it, so it's called Vote Alert. And it will be a tool that will be available online and as an app and by toll-free number where you can talk to somebody live and talk to them about what you're seeing. And then what we do on our side is, as those messages come into us, we distribute them appropriately depending upon what, anything ranging. And we've done this for years, and we get everything from, call 911 to, put it in the file and we'll have to look at it later. But it is so important to capture as much feedback as you can, because what happens is, you get past the flurry of the election, and then you want to make your stand for reform, and you must have empirical evidence to support the reason for that reform. And so if you have the benefit of lots of reports that support the brokenness in any given area, that's how that's, the most effective. Of course, beyond that, though, the idea of, dealing with things in near real time so that if there's a problem, you can quickly remedy it and not just watch things fall to pieces like so many of us, well, ultimately the nation had to do in 2020. But going into it, I saw the cracks in the dam coming, and at that point, there was no way to stop it. I feel very differently about how we're positioned this time. But that's what we're doing. Beyond that, I would say if you're going to go work in the polls, it's most important that you are ready locally. You understand who your team is. And if you see something, you know who you can call. If you have an attorney that's working specifically on the election integrity issues, or maybe specifically with your party or with your candidate or whoever it was that helped you to get into the polls, make sure that you understand what that chain of command should be, because I can tell you it's a bad feeling when you see something happen and you just where do you go? What do you do? You can absolutely always come to True the Vote, and we will field tens of thousands of interactions every cycle. That's just what we expect. But it's also a mindset. You've got to go in knowing that you are the solution. And so if you see something, take action, have your voice heard, make your call, write it down. Don't just let it go. We've let things go for far too long. Report them and then follow up.
And Jen, can I just add to that from my own experience as well? I think reporting it in multiple places is also really important. So I was actually looking around at the Republican National Committee's website today, and they have a whole website now called Protect the Vote. If you go in through the RNC and you look on election integrity, there's an opportunity there to volunteer, to report issues, to support their efforts to get involved. And I would also say, I think when you do see things, you can also reach out to local media. I think getting things out into the public is super important. And I also think reaching out to your local, I'm going to say this, of course, but reaching out to your local Republican unit, because we are the ones that are on the ground. We are on the ground. We are the grassroots army. So I think hit it in multiple ways so that you can be sure the information is being acted upon.
I think that's a great tip. And it's one that's really when people come to me, I say, yeah, let's, I guess I am the media in some respects, to talk media. And then we get it to the media, we get it to the GOP. I've had the chairwoman in California actually deal with some of those claims. And so these are really good, encouraging stories, because it makes people feel like there is a place to go and that their voices are being heard and that their work is not just in vain. And Catherine, I want to say thank you to you. For people who want to support True the Vote, what can they do to get involved?
Go to truethevote.org, and at that top menu bar, you'll see all kinds of ways that you can get involved. But most specifically, click on the word engage, and down will come a number of the projects that we're working on right now. And then plug in and, buckle in and hang on, because we are going at Mach speed right now.
Yeah, absolutely. TrueTheVote.org, TrueTheVote.org. And you can always follow them as well on social media. That's a really important step. True the Vote on X, on all the social media platforms. Catherine Englebrecht, thank you so much for what you're doing. And gosh, I'd love to have you back again. Maybe after the election, we can kind of review what things look like this time around. I feel encouraged it is going to be better than last time. I think we all are awake and present. So thank you. A lot of that due in part to your work. So thank you so much for what you've been doing.
Thanks
nice
so
to
much.
have you. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Another episode of Happy Women Wrapped. Don't forget to do a couple of things. TrueTheVote.org. Get Katie Gorka's book. It's called Next Gen Marxism, wherever you get your books. And of course, give her a follow. You can search her out, Catherine Gorka, on Facebook, or you can find her online, katiegorka.org. And you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Jennifer Horn Radio, and on X and Truth at Jennifer Horn. And thank you so much for being with us. This has been the Happy Women Podcast.